Welcome to the April Hacks Roundup. Today we'll be covering the 9 largest smart contract hacks in April. Let's start with some stats here. Over $93 million were lost due to hacks in Web3 in April. This is less than half of what was lost in March. However, unlike March, most funds that were lost have yet to be recovered. 24 million was lost from DeFi, and the majority of that 93 million was lost from either centralized exchanges or MEV bots. Let's start with the largest hack in April. This hack occurred due to a bug in the MEV Boost relay. MEV Boost is an open source PBS protocol. PBS is proposer-builder separation. Such a protocol seeks to separate these two roles, the role of the builder and the role of the proposer. The role of the builder is to construct a high-value block by including appropriate transactions in the block which they are constructing. The proposers then propose these blocks, which are constructed by the builder. Now, there's a big difference in the barrier to entry for these two roles. Anyone that can run a validator can be a proposer. However, not everyone can be a builder. Being a builder takes a high degree of technical skill in order to produce these high-value blocks. And so because of this, if proposers are also builders, then these proposers have a significant advantage because they're the only ones that can create these high-value blocks. So in order to prevent this problem of collusion, MEV Boost seeks to separate these two roles. The way MEV Boost does this is by creating a trustless marketplace where builders and proposers can work together. And one important component that's introduced here is the relay. The relay is the interface between the builder and the proposer. So essentially what this means is that the builder no longer has to trust the validator or proposer. The builder now just has to trust the relay. Now for this trustlessness to work, it's essential that proposers commit to blocks without being able to see their content. In other words, the block should be revealed to the proposer only after the commitment has been made, essentially after the header has been signed. And this removes the need for builders to trust the validators because the builders are now trusting the relay to act as an intermediary. So what would happen here is that the builder would construct a high-value block and send it over to the relay. The validator then requests some information, including the block hash, and most importantly, the block's profitability. Typically, validators are simply going to choose the block which is most profitable. And so it's essential here that at this stage, the validator does not know the contents of the block. The validator should only know the contents of the block after they've already signed that block header. Unfortunately, what happened in this case is that the validator submitted an invalid block header and the contents of the block were actually revealed. So essentially what happened here was the proposer retrieved the block header and then the block header was tampered with. So you can see over here that the parent root and the state root were set to zeros. And so this made the block header invalid. The attacker then submitted this signed invalid block header to the relay. And because this was signed, the relay actually revealed the block contents to this proposer. And now that the proposer knew the contents of the block, they were able to construct their own block whereby they reordered the transactions in order to be advantageous towards themselves. And the way that the attacker took advantage of this is they first baited various sandwich bots into making large swaps and then sort of did a counter sandwich attack to drain these sandwich bots. Let's go through each step of this hack. The attacker started a few weeks before the actual hack, and this first step was to register a validator. Then leading up to the hack, the attacker sent multiple transactions to the public mempool. These transactions were large swaps with infinite slippage. And so this was intended to bait various sandwich bots into trying to attack these swaps with infinite slippage and sort of extract the value from them. And in fact, several bots did pick up on these transactions sent to the public mempool. These bots created bundles and submitted them to a particular builder. The builder then constructed a block containing these bundles and submitted it to the ultrasound relay. Now, the attacker requested the block header from the ultrasound relay, and then they tampered with it. They tampered with it by setting the state root to 0. And then they submitted this to the ultrasound relay. And the ultrasound relay actually revealed the contents of the block at this point to the proposer. So the attacker, the proposer, now knows the contents of this block. But this block wasn't actually accepted because the block header was invalid due to the tampering by the attacker. So now the attacker knows the contents of the block, and the block actually hasn't been used. So the attacker is able to reconstruct this block to exploit those sandwich attack attempts and extract value from those sandwich bots. And so the attacker then publishes this constructed block, or sends this constructed block, signs this constructed block to, and sends it to the relayer, which then propagates this block. Now the response here started with a user on Twitter who tweeted about it around 6 a.m. on April 3rd. About half an hour after this, the ultrasound relay team created a war room together with the Flashbots team. About an hour and a half after the attack, the ultrasound team disabled their relay. So at this point, they must have realized some component of this hack involved the relay. An hour later, someone was able to reconstruct the attack and shared this reconstruction in the Flashbots Discord. So it was realized at this point that the problem wasn't something to do with the deployment of the ultrasound relay. It was actually a problem with the software this was running, and the Flashbots relay was running the very same software. So the Flashbots team also disabled their own relay. Finally, a patch was developed and released on the testnet approximately 4 hours after this tweet, the first tweet, was published. And then an hour after that, the relays began to deploy the patch on mainnet. Now, the root cause of this hack was that the block contents were revealed to the proposer even though the block was invalid. So the simple fix here is to simply not reveal these contents if the block is invalid. Basically, if the MEV Boost relay fails to successfully publish the blocks, the beacon nodes, the block body should not be revealed to the proposer. Others were suggesting that relays should not return the body of the block at all to proposers. However, it's important to keep in mind that some proposers may have a way to get around this, so they could perform what's called an eclipse attack. An eclipse attack would involve monopolizing all connections to and from a relay's beacon nodes. There's also another possible attack. This could happen when a proposer has 2 consecutive slots. So close to the end of the very first slot, the proposer is going to sign the block. However, this will not give the relay enough time to propagate this block. And so for the second slot, the proposer already knows the contents of that block. Such an attack can be mitigated by not revealing this content of the block if it is too close to the end of the slot. Next up, we have Yearn, which was also hacked in April. Yearn Finance is a yield aggregator protocol which seeks to optimize yield for its users. Now, the root cause of this hack was a misconfigured token address from a deprecated contract deployed over 3 years ago. And this hack resulted in $11 million worth of assets being stolen. The vulnerable contract in question was actually an old Y token. And in order to explain this hack, we first have to explain how the Y token works. So if you're a user on Yearn and you want to earn yield through Yearn, you would deposit some underlying token into a Y token contract. Let's suppose you wanted to deposit USDT. Then you would deposit into the YUSDT contract. When you do this, the YUSDT contract is also going to mint some YUSDT tokens to you. And these YUSDT tokens represent your share of the value held in the Y token contract. Now, it's important to realize that this Y token is actually a yield-bearing token. And where does this yield come from? So when tokens are deposited into the Y token contract, these funds are then deployed to some DeFi protocol. Could be Aave, Compound, DYDX, Fulcrum, or some other DeFi protocol. And how are these DeFi protocols chosen? How does the Y token decide whether to deposit into Aave, Compound, or Fulcrum? So what the Y token does is it uses an oracle for APR in order to select the DeFi protocol with the highest APR. In fact, there is a rebalance function available that anyone can call to ensure that the funds are sent to the DeFi protocol with the highest APR. So let's say that our funds are currently on Aave, but the APR of Aave drops. Then someone calls the rebalance function, and when that happens, because the APR of Compound is higher, the funds are migrated from Aave to Compound in order to earn from that high APR and maximize yield for the users. Now, the root cause, as mentioned, was a misconfigured token address. Over here in the code of the constructor for the YUSDT contract, we can see the fulcrum address is assigned over here. However, the wrong address is assigned. You would expect the IUSDT address to be assigned over here, but in fact, the IUSDC address is assigned, and this misconfiguration allowed for the manipulation of reserves, which led to this hack. Let's go over each step of this hack. The attacker actually used two attack contracts. Let's call them attack contract 1 and attack contract 2. Attack contract 1 did most of the work. So first, the attack contract 1 receives a flash loan. And in this flash loan, they receive DAI, USDC, and USDT. They convert most of this to USDT in order to maximize the impact of the hack. Then attack contract 1 transfers some USDT to attack contract 2. The attack contract 2 is then going to repay some loans on Aave in order to plummet the APR for lending USDT on Aave. So this is because Aave's lending rate, or the interest rate you get from lending, depends on the utilization rate, or the amount that's borrowed. So if all the loans have been repaid, then the APR is going to be very low. This will become important later on when the attacker rebalances the Y token in order to move funds between protocols. In step 3 over here, the attacker deposits some USDT into the Y token. And when this happens, the Y token mints YUSDT to the attack contract. Now let's take a look at these numbers over here. The attacker deposited 900K USDT and they got 824K YUSDT back. Notice how these numbers are similar, 900K versus 824K. Later on, what we're going to see is that the attacker deposited a small amount of USDT and then got minted a massive amount of YUSDT. And the way this happened was because this calculation for the YUSDT is highly dependent on the reserves within the Y token contract. And this reserve manipulation starts to happen on the sixth step over here. In this step, the attack contract deposits some USDC into the Fulcrum IUSDC contract. The attack contract then receives some IUSDC tokens. These tokens are then transferred directly to the Y token, the YUSDT token contract. Now it's important to realize that at this point, these IUSDC tokens are actually counted as part of the reserves of the Y token contract. This is important because later on we're going to see these reserves essentially disappear. Then the attack contract redeems all their YUSDT to take out all the reserve USDT out of the Y token contract. And in step 8 is where the reserve manipulation actually happens. So the attack contract calls the rebalance function over here. And because the Aave APR has plummeted due to the earlier manipulation, a new lending provider is assigned. So what happens is all the reserve tokens here are redeemed here for the underlying token from the DeFi protocols. As part of that, the Y token tries to redeem this IUSDC over here from Fulcrum to get USDC back. Now, before this happens, that IUSDC is actually counted as part of the Y token reserves. But once this is redeemed for USDC, that USDC that's received is not counted as part of the Y token's reserves. So the reserve has essentially dropped to 0. Now, in order to take advantage of this very low reserve, the attacker actually has to deposit 1 way worth of USDT. Otherwise, they would not be able to take advantage of this low reserve price or this low reserve value. In the next step here, the attacker deposits a relatively small amount of USDT in order to be minted a massive amount of YUSDT, way more than they really should have. The attacker then uses this YUSDT to swap for other tokens on Curve. As you can probably imagine, the effect on the Curve LPs was pretty bad here because of these swaps that were made on the Curve pools from the YUSDT tokens to other tokens. Now, both Yearn and Curve acknowledged the hack on Twitter, and they mentioned that this hack was on a contract which had been deprecated for a long time. Fortunately, the rest of Yearn remained unaffected because most of its 450 million TVL was spread across newer contracts which were not deprecated. Now, in order to prevent this type of a vulnerability, it's important to check all the hard-coded addresses referenced by a contract. In this case, the wrong Fulcrum address was referenced. Instead of referencing the IUSDT contract, the IUSDC contract was referenced. And so the hard-coded addresses should always be double-checked. Also, this YUSDT token was not audited, and if it was audited, an auditor would very likely have detected that an incorrect address was used in the constructor. Also, perhaps some incentive to migrate the funds from this old contract to a newer vault may have helped mitigate this attack, as less funds would have been present on this deprecated and vulnerable contract. Also, tools like FlashSyn could be used to perform fuzzing in order to identify these exploit paths, and this particular exploit path could have been identified using FlashSyn. Next, we have a chart of 100 Finance's TVL in April. As you can see, the protocol's TVL was approximately 10 million before the hack, and this dwindled down to 2.5 million after the hack. 100 Finance is a multi-chain lending protocol deployed on Ethereum, Optimism, Arbitrum, as well as several other chains. 100 Finance is also a compound fork. One of its distinguishing features is its implementation of V-tokenomics for its governance token called the HND token. On April 15th, 100 Finance was hacked for 7 million on Optimism. Also, the HND token's price dropped by half the next day. The root cause of this hack was that the comptroller was listing an empty market for HWBTC. So there was the normal market for HWBTC over here, and there was an empty one that was not used by the normal users of the protocol. And it was this empty market that was exploited by the hacker in order to execute this hack. Let's review how C tokens or H tokens normally work. Normally, a user deposits an underlying asset such as WBTC into the H token. So in this case, if they're depositing WBTC, they would be deploying into the HWBTC contract. At this point, the HWBTC contract would actually mint some HWBTC tokens back to the user. And so there's an exchange happening here, essentially, of WBTC for HWBTC. Users can also redeem their HWBTC token for the original WBTC token. Now, a typical exchange rate here is that if you deposited 1 WBTC, you might get 50 HWBTC back. That's a fairly typical rate for Compound and its forks. However, the attacker manipulated this rate such that 1 HWBTC was worth 25 billion WBTC. So how did they do that? Well, the hacker used the empty market of HWBTC. This had nothing in it at first. So the hacker makes a tiny WBTC deposit into this contract, at which point they receive a tiny amount of HWBTC back. Then the hacker transfers 500 WBTC directly to the HWBTC contract. So at this point, there's a lot of WBTC in this contract. However, there's only a small amount of total supply of the HWBTC token. And all those tokens belong to this hacker over here, since they minted the only HWBTC minted over here. So this means we have a very small amount of HWBTC and a very large amount of WBTC. And so the exchange rate is skewed such that 1 HWBTC is worth 25 billion WBTC. So at this point, the hacker has approximately $15 million worth of collateral in the form of that HWBTC. The hacker takes a loan of, say, $2 million worth of ETH, and this loan is collateralized at the moment by this $15 million worth of collateral. However, the hacker then tries to withdraw all their collateral, And this should not be allowed, right? Because they have an outstanding loan. And so the hacker really should only be able to withdraw the excess part of the collateral that's not supporting this loan. However, the hacker is actually able to withdraw all of his collateral over here. And so why did that happen? In order to redeem this collateral, the hacker called this function called redeem underlying. And as a parameter to that redeem underlying, the hacker has to provide the amount of collateral they want back. So they said they want their 500 WBTC back. So the protocol has to calculate how many H tokens is 500 WBTC. So it has to do this conversion over here by dividing this number, this 500 WBTC, by the exchange rate. Now remember that this exchange rate has become massive because of the manipulations done by the hacker. And so this results in a rounding error. The precise number of this computation over here is 0.000000019. However, due to the rounding down, this 9 here is truncated or discarded, and so only this 1 remains over here. The hacker has double this amount of HWBTC, and so it appears that they only need to burn half of their HWBTC in order to redeem 500 WBTC. However, this should not be the case because really this is all the collateral of the hacker and they should not be able to withdraw it. However, this rounding error has made it look like the hacker will still have half their collateral left, and so now this withdrawal of collateral is allowed. Here's another similar hack which happened in January. This happened on the LenHub protocol, and this was also due to a misconfiguration. In fact, in this case, the controller also listed 2 different markets for the same token. The only difference in this case is that the old market, or the unused market, was still referencing the old controller. And in this case, what the hacker did was they deposited their collateral into the old market over here, took a loan out in a new market, and then they're still able to withdraw their collateral because this controller over here is not aware of the debt taken on in the new contracts. And so the hacker is able to take out this loan, never pay it back, and also withdraw their collateral. So in this sense, it's a very similar attack to Yearn Finance. Now the team noticed an alert from Hypernative 14 minutes after the hack. And immediately after they noticed this, they posted on social media that a hack had occurred. They also paused the protocol very quickly after this. They then sent an on-chain message to the hacker in order to negotiate the return of funds. Also, they made a great effort to warn other Compound fork teams, as technically this vulnerability is present in many of them. However, in order to be exploited, the comptroller would have to list that empty token market. Also, the team posted a 500K bounty for information leading to the hacker's arrest or the return of the stolen funds. Now, something clearly went wrong either in the deployment of these contracts or perhaps when some update to the protocol was made. So the testing of deployment scripts or the testing of update scripts could potentially have flagged the creation of extra empty markets. And had the test detected this, the team likely would have closed down this market in order to prevent this hack from occurring. Also, an audit firm could have been contacted for a deployment check. So an audit firm would have gone through the state of the contract and would have detected that empty markets were listed and that such a vulnerability was possible. Also, this vulnerability has been present in the Compound v2 code since launch. Once again, in order to execute this exploit or take advantage of this vulnerability, you still have to list this empty market in the comptroller. One way to mitigate this rounding problem is to mint a small amount of H tokens when the market is launched. Another potential mitigation here is to have another check on the smart contract level to bound the rounding error. So in this case, it may have looked like the rounding error was very small, but since the H token was worth so much, the rounding error was extremely significant. Yearn was not the only established DeFi protocol to be hacked in April. Sushiswap also suffered a hack, which resulted in users losing over $3.3 million worth of assets. The main problem here was a vulnerable route processor contract, which allowed the attacker to specify an arbitrary contract as a swapping contract. Ultimately, this allowed the attacker to exploit the approvals given to the router contract. The vulnerable contract was deployed across 14 different chains, and a quick response from the community helped to limit the damage from this hack. In order to execute this exploit, the hacker had to call this function here, process route. Now, an important parameter of this process route function is this route parameter over here. This route parameter contains the address of the pool used to perform the swap. And what the attacker did is they didn't specify a normal Uniswap v3 pool. They specified some contract which they themselves had created. Now, this route is passed on to the process route internal function, which is going to read this route into a stream over here, and then the stream is passed on to the process myERC20 function. The process myERC20 function passes the stream on to distribute and swap, which in turn passes the stream on to the swap function over here. The swap function is going to then call swap unit v3 along with the stream parameter. And finally, we see the pool address here being read from the stream. Remember that this stream was derived completely from user input, and so this pool here is specified by the user. In the case of the attacker, they haven't specified a normal Uniswap v3 pool, they've specified some contract which they themselves have created. And now a swap function is going to be called on that contract of the attacker. So when this happens, the attack contract, when executing this function, is going to use the callback function on the router. This callback function is called Uniswap v3 swap callback, and it's actually quite a dangerous function because, as you can see over here, it can cause tokens to be transferred from any user that has approved the router to the caller of this function. And so this results in tokens being transferred from normal users of the protocol into that attack contract which was performing that swap. And this was what was used to drain these users' wallets of their approved tokens. Now, it's interesting here to note that there's a comment above this function which says the caller of this method must be checked to be a Uniswap v3 pool deployed by the canonical Uniswap v3 factory. However, this check was not done in the callback. And so it seems that in this version of the code, somehow this check was missed. As we saw, the code comment was ignored, and that formed an important part of the specification. So it's important to always verify that the implementations are matching the specifications, and if not, there could be a serious bug or vulnerability introduced. Also, developers and auditors should be on high alert for any locations in a codebase where some contract address is provided as an input parameter. This could result in some malicious function on that contract being called. In February, we saw this type of exploit happening on many different DEX aggregators, where the DEX aggregators weren't validating the address of the DEX pools. Also, some type of MetaMask Snap extension may have been able to warn users that they were giving approval to a router that had only been deployed 4 days prior. And so the fact that this router was new would mean that it was more risky, and this might have discouraged users from approving this contract. Now, the response was a coordinated effort between the Sushiswap team as well as the community. And so there were whitehead efforts from both the Sushiswap team as well as some rogue security researchers. A form was made available to users to compensate them with the recovered funds, and for unrecoverable funds, they were dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So there was a fairly quick response from the team, whereby they first warned the users to revoke their approvals, and then several white hat operations were executed to drain these approved tokens as well, in order to make sure that the hackers aren't getting their hands on them. The ZeroVix protocol was also hacked in April. ZeroVix is a Polygon-based lending protocol, and it also happens to be a Compound fork. Now, just like Compound, ZeroVix provides over-collateralized lending. Users can become liquidity providers in ZeroVix by depositing their assets into liquidity pools in order to obtain O tokens. Now, the protocol was exploited on April 28th due to a vulnerability in the VGHST oracle. This exploit resulted in a loss of $4.3 million worth of assets. The profit for the exploiter was about 2 million. VGHST is a synthetic asset that represents a share in the Gotchi vault. The Gotchi vault is where users' GHST tokens and Aave Gotchis are collectively managed. Now, since VGHST is a synthetic asset, it doesn't have its own direct price fee. However, the ZeroVix team wanted to support the borrowing of the VGHST token, and so they needed to introduce an oracle for determining the VGHST price. This oracle used the following price calculation. Basically, the price of VGHST was determined by the number of GHST represented by 1 VGHST multiplied by the price of GHST. This component of the price calculation here, the number of GHST represented by 1 VGHST, is actually manipulatable. It can be inflated by donating GHST tokens into the Gotchi vault. Let's see how that works. Let's suppose we have a Gotchi vault over here that has 4 GHST tokens. And let's also suppose that we have 2 users, each of which has 1 VGHST token. So we have a total of 4 GHST tokens and a total of 2 VGHST tokens. So that means each VGHST tokens is worth 2 GST tokens. However, what happens if I donate 2 more GHST tokens to the vault? If this happens, then we have 6 GHST tokens in the vault. However, we still have 2 VGHST tokens that are possessed by the users collectively. This means that each VGHST token is now worth 3 GHST tokens. And so now the price calculation has been manipulated, and particularly the component here, the number of GHST tokens represented by a 1 VGHST token has been manipulated over here. And so how did the attacker use this inflation of the price in order to execute the exploit? Well, first we should mention that there's basically an inherent assumption in the protocol here that updates to the collateral or debt price can only occur through the oracle. However, as we've just seen, the price of VGHST can be inflated by donating GHST into the Gotchi vault. And so here's how the exploiter used this problem to their advantage. They first started by depositing some collateral in the protocol. They then borrowed some VGHST against this collateral. Then they transferred or donated some GHST into the Gotchi vault. As we've seen before, this is going to sharply increase the VGHST price. So now this means that the amount we borrowed in the second step here is going to be worth a lot more. Now, because the value of the loan here has increased, it's no longer supported by the collateral and the position is liquidatable. So finally, the attacker liquidates their position, and when they do this, they actually obtain a discount on the underlying collateral. And this is how they steal funds from the protocol. Let's go over each step of the hack. The first step of the hack here was that the attacker initiated a flash loan for 24 million USDC, 6 million USDT, and almost 2 million GHST. Now, I should mention here that there are 2 attack contracts involved. There's a liquidator as well as a borrower. The purpose of the liquidator is to liquidate the unhealthy position of the borrower, and the purpose of the borrower is to simply create an unhealthy position which can be liquidated. So the liquidator deposits the USDT from the flash loan and borrows various assets from ZeroVix. Now the borrower contract then deposits all this USDC as collateral and recursively borrows VGHST. This is going to become important later when the attacker inflates the price of VGHST because this position is going to become liquidatable. Next, the borrower borrows various other assets from ZeroVix. At this point, the position is still healthy and it's still over-collateralized. However, this all changes when the liquidator manipulates the VGHST price by donating a large amount of GHST tokens directly to the Gotchi vault. This now changes the exchange rate between GHST and VGHST from almost 1 to 1.78. You could say that it's close to doubled over here. And so now the amount we borrowed in step 3 over here has also doubled in value. And this amount that we borrowed is no longer supported by the collateral. This means that the liquidator can proceed to liquidate this position, taking advantage of that discount they received when they purchased the liquidated collateral. Now, this exploit occurred at 10:45 a.m. on April 28th. And the vulnerability was actually deployed just over a month before that on March 17th. The team actually detected and investigated this activity at 11 a.m. with a security partner. They were able to identify the root cause of the exploit, and a few hours later, they paused the protocol on all chains. The team also attempted to contact the exploiter through on-chain messages in order to persuade them to return funds. Finally, the team contacted law enforcement on May 1st, and they also released a detailed postmortem on May 11th. This type of vulnerability can be prevented through economic analysis and threat modeling. Specifically, it can be very helpful to look at each component of a price calculation and try to determine which parts of that calculation can be manipulated. So if we did this for the price calculation of the VGHST token, we might have determined here that that part of the calculation, the number of GHST represented by one VGHST, could have been manipulated easily through the donation mechanism. Next, we have a chart of Sentiment's TVL in April. As you can see, the protocol had a TVL of approximately 10 million before the hack, and this dropped all the way down to 3.5 million after the hack. Sentiment is a leverage yield farming protocol on Arbitrum. The way it works is that lenders provide liquidity to the protocol, and borrowers borrow these funds with leverage and deploy those funds onto DeFi protocols. Some of the protocols that integrate with Sentiment include Balancer, Aave Curve, and others. On April 4th, Sentiment was hacked for approximately $1 million worth of assets on Arbitrum. Now, if you've been watching these monthly hack roundup videos, this diagram is probably starting to look a little familiar. And that's because this is yet another read-only reentrancy vulnerability resulting in price manipulation of an LP token. In this case, we're dealing with a Balancer LP token, specifically related to the pool with wrapped Bitcoin, wrapped Ether, and USDC. The way Sentiment calculates the value of this LP token is that they take the total value in the Balancer pool and divide it by the total supply of the pool token. However, the attacker was able to manipulate this formula in order to inflate the value of the collateral, in particular when this LP token was used as collateral. So what the attacker did in this case is they started by removing liquidity from Balancer. When this happens, the pool tokens are burned. This means that the total supply of the pool tokens has immediately decreased and is going to return a lower value. So right away, we see that this bottom component of the calculation here is going to become smaller, resulting in the overall price increasing. So what happens here after the pool tokens are burned is that these underlying pool tokens are sent back to whoever is removing liquidity. In this case, it's being sent back to the attack contract. So as part of this, ETH is withdrawn from the pool and sent to the attack contract. When this happens, the fallback function on the attack contract is invoked. So the attack contract is going to use this as an opportunity here to take a massive loan from Sentiment. And Sentiment has to decide whether to give out this loan or not. And the attack contract has a lot of collateral in the form of this Balancer LP token. And so Sentiment now needs to figure out how much is this LP token worth. It goes back to this formula over here. But we already know that this formula is going to give us a wrong result because the total supply of the pool token has been decreased, but the total value in the pool has not yet been entirely decreased. There are still some tokens over here that have not been sent back to the attack contract. And so this price over here of the LP token is going to be greatly inflated. And so Sentiment thinks that the attack contract has far more collateral than it really does, and so it allows this massive under-collateralized loan, and the attacker is able to steal these funds from the protocol. Here's another very similar hack which happened just a few months ago in January. This happened on the Midas protocol. There's a few differences here. First of all, we're dealing with a Curve LP token instead of a Balancer LP token. Another difference is this hack happened on Polygon, so we're dealing with Matic instead of ETH. However, almost everything else remains the same. One other minor difference here is that rather than getting the total supply of the LP token directly, we're using this get virtual price function. However, under the hood, this does something very similar. In fact, it's directly dependent on the total supply of the LP token. And so what happens here is this function returns an inflated price when the fallback function is invoked when withdrawing MATID. And the same thing happens in this hack. This massive under-collateralized loan is taken from Midas, which Midas allows because it thinks that the collateral in the form of this LP token is extremely valuable, even though it's not. Here's yet another very similar hack, which happened in February, this time on the dForce protocol. This is actually slightly different than the other ones, because over here we have the LP tokens being burned after the underlying pool tokens were returned to whoever is removing liquidity. So this results in the opposite effect. Rather than inflating the collateral value, we're actually deflating the collateral value because get virtual price is going to return a smaller value. The reason being that the total value of the LP token is actually high relative to the underlying value in the pool. So what the attacker did in this case is they used this to their advantage to deflate the collateral value and perform premature liquidations on healthy positions in dForce. And they were able to make a profit this way and steal funds from the protocol. Now, the Sentiment team paused the protocol about 2 hours after the exploit. They also sent an on-chain message to the hacker, and the hacker was relatively quick to respond. In fact, by the next day, the hacker had returned 90% of the funds in exchange for a 10% bounty. The team also applied a fix the day after the hack. Also, insurance policies covered part of the funds not recovered from the hacker. This vulnerability of LP tokens has been known since April of 2022. There have been many hacks which have occurred due to this vulnerability. And the most commonly used fix for this is to call a cheap state changing function with a reentrancy guard on the balancer vault. This ensures that if we were to re-enter the contract when we're retrieving the price, well, we would never get there because this function, the state changing function with the reentrancy guard, would fail. And so this ensures that we're not re-entering the contract when we're retrieving the price. Now, known vulnerabilities of tokens should always be considered as part of the process when deciding to add a new collateral token to the protocol. And it's not a bad idea to consult with a security or an audit team to figure out how to safely incorporate this collateral. Because we've seen many times that protocols incorporate new collateral into the protocol, especially LP tokens, in an incorrect way, which results in a hack. Also, potentially, future scanning tools could be used to detect this type of vulnerability. This is a well-known vulnerability that has been exploited many times, and so theoretically, a scanning tool should be possible, a scanning tool which can detect this type of vulnerability. Metapoint is a multiverse platform which saw about 920K loss due to a hack on Binance Smart Chain. Now, in Metapoint, each user has their own deposit contract, shown in green over here. And these deposit contracts contain an approve function. Now, whenever anyone calls this approve function, what happens is the caller is approved to spend the tokens from the deposit contract. So what the attack contract shown in red over here did is they simply called this approve function on the user's deposit contract, and this resulted in the attack contract being approved to spend tokens from the user's deposit contract. So the attack contract simply called this approve function on many users' deposit contracts and was able to drain the tokens in this way. Next, we have Allbridge, which is a bridge protocol, but also has a DEX component. And in particular, it's the DEX part that was exploited within this hack. Allbridge saw about 520K loss due to this hack on Binance Smart Chain. So the first part of the hack here involves taking a flash loan of BUSD from PancakeSwap. Then various operations are performed on the DEX pool, including the depositing of liquidity, the removal of liquidity, and various swaps. Now, in this final swap over here, we see that 40K of stablecoins are swapped for 789K of a different stablecoin. And so something has clearly gone wrong. In particular, the prices here for these tokens relative to each other have been manipulated. And this happened largely due to all those operations which were done on the swap pools. If we look down here, we'll see a formula over here which determines the price of these tokens in the DEX pool. And various parameters in here are related to the liquidity within the pool. And so by manipulating the liquidity within the pool, the attacker was able to manipulate the price for these tokens, which led to this malicious swap over here, where a small amount of stablecoin was swapped for a large amount of stablecoin. Next, we have Swapos on the Binance Smart Chain, which saw about 467K lost due to the hack. Now, Swapos is a Uniswap v2 fork, and let's have a look at the difference in the code. So here we have the code of Uniswap v2. You can see here that when we retrieve this balance, we're multiplying something here first by 1,000, and then there's another number we're multiplying by 3. And then finally over here, we're doing a check here to ensure that the Uniswap's K value here is respected. Now, if we look over at Swapos, there are some modifications. So this balance here is not multiplied by 1,000, it's multiplied by 10,000. And this amount here is not multiplied by 3, it's multiplied by 10. However, you don't see any corresponding changes in this K value check here. And so this K value check is no longer effective. And this allows an exploiter to steal funds from the DEX. Let's move on to the Gemholic incident. Gemholic was trying to raise funds on zkSync. However, on April 5th, Gemholic Eco's pre-sale funds got locked due to the usage of the transfer function. Now, transfer and send can lead to failures when sending Ether if the fallback function needs more than 2,300 gas. This also applies to Ethereum. When message value exceeds 0 on zkSync, zkSync's system contract known as Message Value Simulator uses more than the 2,300 gas stipend, and so this transfer function is always going to fail. Now, due to this fixed gas stipend, zkSync recommends in their documentation to use the call function. This is also the recommended approach in Ethereum. Now, to solve this issue, zkSync set a new gas minimum for the message value simulator calls, and when this is deployed to production, this should allow Gemholic to unlock their pre-sale funds over here. Next, we have a whole bunch of security incidents related to centralized exchanges, private key compromises, and rug pulls. So most notably here, we have 2 large hacks on centralized exchanges. We have 23 million lost from the BitTrue exchange and 13 million lost from GDAC. We also have a notable rug pull here from the Merlin DEX, which saw about $1.8 million worth of assets lost. And then, interestingly enough, we also have Terraport here, in which a user or someone infiltrated the team and eventually stole $2 million worth of assets. Here are some other exploits which have happened in April, most notably Filda over here, which saw about 700K loss due to an exploit on the Elasto Smart Chain and the Ray network. And this also happened due to abuse of empty abandoned markets, just as in the case of 100 Finance. Then we have a few other smaller hacks here, which were caused by reentrancy vulnerabilities, access control issues, price manipulation, and then we have a few more hacks here, which were also caused by price manipulation. Let's talk about some of the trends we've seen in April. First, 4 of the largest hacks happened on lending protocols. This includes 100 Finance, 0VIX, Sentiment, and Filda. At least 4 of the hacked protocols were actually compound forks. This would include 100 Finance, 0VIX, Filda, and DeFi. Now, what we've seen is that these attacks on lending protocols typically involve 3 different types of attack vectors. The first one over here is taking a large under-collateralized loan, and this is what happened in the case of Sentiment funds. Then we have invalid liquidation of assets. This is what happened with 0VIX. Finally, we have the inappropriate withdrawal of collateral, which is what happened in the 100 Finance hack. We also saw a bunch of configuration issues leading to hacks in April, and at least 2 of these hacks were due to empty markets and compound forks. This was the case for 100 Finance as well as Filda. The Yearn Finance hack was due to an incorrect configuration of a stored address within the Y token contract. Now, to prevent issues like this in the future, tests should be written to ensure the correct contract state after any update is made. Also, auditing firms could be engaged for deployment or configuration checks after some critical change has been made to the protocol. And so these firms could ensure that the state of the protocol is secure. We also saw lots and lots of price manipulation attacks in April. 5 of the largest hacks we covered involved some type of price manipulation. And overall, at least 10 hacks in April involved price manipulation. Each of these hacks seem to have a different root cause. For example, in Sentiment, this was caused by read-only reentrancy. And in the case of ZeroVix, we had a vulnerable calculation. We had bad configuration issues in the case of Yearn and a rounding error in the case of 100 Finance. Here are some other trends we've seen. Token donation was used to facilitate at least 2 large hacks. This was the case for 100 Finance as well as ZeroVix. And at least 2 hacks were caused by access control issues, which includes Metapoint and Unlock Protocol. You might also consider the Sushiswap hack an issue due to access control. Also, at least three hacks were caused by validation issues. This brings us to the end of April. Thanks so much for joining us. For the May Hacks Roundup, we'll be covering Level Finance, DataStao, and more. Thanks again for joining us today. For more security content, check out our Twitter at Quantstamp and our YouTube channel, Quantstamp HQ.